Welcome all to this webinar. Today we'll discuss grassroots climate activism. And the title is From Paris to Amazon. And this is to indicate the great span of organizations working on climate change at the international level through many different strategies. And the webinar today, we've invited prominent climate activists from around the world, as well as scholars, to help us understand what are the better strategies and what roles do NGOs fill in this important policy space where government action is so difficult. My name is Siri Gloppen. I'm a professor at the University of Bergen and direct the Center on Law and Social Transformation in Bergen. I also teach at the Bergen Summer Research School. And this year we have a course on the global climate governance regime. And this webinar forms part of that course. But we wanted to give all of you the opportunity to join, since we're so happy with our guests. And the first panelist who will be speaking to us today is Nimo Bassi. Nimo is a Nigerian environmental activist, and he's an architect, author, poet, and he has worked for many, many years on climate change activism. And at many different levels. So he was also chair of Friends of the Earth International for many years, and now works with and heads a Nigerian or an NGO in Nigeria called Health of Mother Earth Foundation. And we're very lucky to have him and to be able to listen to him. I will briefly introduce the rest of the panelists before I give the word to you, Nimo. Our second panelist, Julio Prieto, is an Ecuadorian lawyer, and he's a practicing lawyer and advocate. He is also an environmental activist more broadly and a scholar. And he has been central to one of the iconic cases in this area, the case of Ecuador against Chevron, that the people of Ecuador took the oil company to court over environmental damage. We also have scholars with us. So Deborah Delgado is professor of sociology at the POCP in Peru. And her area of research includes global and local environmental politics and sustainable development politics. So she will be able to look at this also from an academic perspective. And the same is true for Camila Gianella, who will be well known to those who are students in the course, because she's also one of the course leaders. And she is a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. She is Peruvian, and she has a PhD in psychology and a training in public health and the social sciences, and can bring other perspectives to bear. So without taking up more time, I want to give the word to you, Nimo, please.
Thank you very much, Siri. It's a big pleasure for me to be able to speak to you and to all the participants in this webinar. Pardon me if my internet freezes. We will be having a lot of challenges with regard to that. I will be quick, and I'll be sharing some slides. I hope I can find it. Yes.
I just wanted to add before you start that please, if you have any comments, questions, use the Q&A, use the chat function, and we'll relay the questions. So yes, please.
Right, thank you so much. So I'll be speaking about grassroots activism, NGOs, and the connection to international activism generally. And I want to just begin by going through some very fundamental things I'm sure we're all very familiar with, but just to remind ourselves, because my presentation is also basically quite basic. Now, the grassroots is themselves. When you hear about grassroots activism, there are many things that come to mind, and sometimes people believe that the grassroots are only found in the global south, which is totally wrong. The grassroots is found all over the world. It could be a community, it could be a residential part of a city. They could be found on the factory floor. The grassroots are the people who are basically impacted by policy, by activities, by actions, or by some decisions by other individuals, organizations, or by whatever entity. So what makes grassroots is that the grassroots is grounded in a particular context. And the struggle, the actions are based on a certain situation that needs to be changed. And so they act as a social force that mobilizes collective action, that can act as an intermediary between the bigger society and a smaller section. They could also sometimes be mediators, or they could just be instigators by dreaming up certain actions or noticing what is wrong, and they really want to see that situation changed. So there are many kinds of grassroots activities. There are some who are based on development issues, but I'm more rooted in environmental justice campaigns. But even when we talk about environmental justice campaigns, environmental justice covers a lot of things. We talk about social justice, gender justice, human rights, disability issues, and of course, we take on governance at a certain level, not in terms of ensuring that those who are in charge of certain activities actually do things in a way that is transparent, in a way that's acceptable. So in sum, the grassroots, as you can see, I used a picture of the logo of Groundwork, a South African NGO, and it does show that what you see above the ground is not as big as what is beneath the ground. So the grassroots is really a very big force, sometimes not recognized, but a force that can move and create a storm. And I find that logo very, very illustrative. Now, the Africa on top of the human beings there is not necessarily what you find in the actual logo, but this does illustrate that being in South Africa, they're actually carrying the continent on their shoulders. Now, grassroots activism operates best in networks and movements. And for some years, as Siri mentioned, I led Friends of the Earth International, a grassroots group that has membership in over 70 countries. When you're working in a network that is so broad, you end up having a lot of people with different ideas, different inclinations, different political persuasions, but you must find a common grounds on which to come together as a force, which means necessarily sometimes you have to lay aside certain peculiarities, certain things you like to see happen, but the majority of the people don't agree that is important or that is the major thing to be focused on. So the grassroots, very broad. And one of the big challenges is really that sometimes it's difficult to come to a common focus, that this is one thing that must be tackled. But sometimes again, the help, what really helps is also that the issues that needs to bring people together sometimes is so huge and so visible and so big, so singular, that it's very easy to connect people. And so the organizers of movements, of networks, must learn to be persistent, to be patient, and of course, to be ready to share. And that's what really makes networks and movements powerful. Sharing of capacities, sharing of experiences, not building capacities, because already when the network comes together, there's already a lot of capacity. So the issue is how to share those capacities, how to amplify those capacities, and how to use those capacities to build the momentum for what needs to be changed. So what I've noticed really in terms of climate justice campaigns is that before any grassroots activist or network or movement would make much progress, we have to own the narrative. We have to determine what is the story behind the crisis. What is the story by which those who are driving the system, what is the story behind the crisis? What is the reason? What's the argument that the leaders or those who are the transnational corporations, what stories are they telling that gives them the energy, the power, the impetus to keep doing what they're doing, which the grassroots are complaining about? And so, well, I personally spend a lot of time with communities, with individuals, figuring out what is the basic story, because we find that the imaginaries of the people determines the action they're going to take. And so we go to, sometimes we go to poetry, we go to music, songs, we go to fiction stories, because you can really find what people really believe and what they're ready to fight for within those creative spaces. And of course, the key demand that some of us have been engaged in over the years is to ensure that there is restorative justice. Now, I want to give an example of a movement that has both inspired me and is very, very instructive to learn from. And that is called the Movement for the Survival of Ogoni People, MOSOP. That's the short name for it. In 1990, MOSOP led the Ogoni people in Nigeria. The Ogoni people were just 500,000 people in terms of population at that time. And this movement had over 80% of the people in that territory being a part of this movement. And they issued a Bill of Rights, which was a political demand they sent to the Nigerian government, asking for an end to colonial impulses that had remained long after colonialism had supposedly ended in Nigeria and through the years of military rule and misrule. And so they sent that document asking to be recognized, their culture to be recognized. They asked for a cleanup of the environment, which was devastated by operations of international oil corporations. And this was so big a movement that 3 years later, when they had not heard anything from the government, they came together and said, look, Shell, that's a company that was in that region, is no longer recognized in that territory. And they expelled the oil companies from Ogoni land from 1993. And as I speak today, MOSOP is still powerful, they're still organizing, and they're still resisting the reopening of the oil wells in that particular part of Nigeria. There's been a lot of struggles. I mean, people lost their lives. I'm sure you're aware of that. You heard about Ken Saro-Wiwa, the leader of this movement, who was executed by the military on 10th November 1995. But the good thing is that as we speak, the oil wells are still not reopened. And rather, as the MOSOP requested, they asked for a cleanup of the environment. From 2011, there was a report from the United Nations who carried out an assessment of the Ogoni environment and showed how devastated the environment had been and demanded that it should be cleaned up. So from 2016, the process of actually cleaning up the environment started. It's a very slow process. Not much has been achieved as we speak, but really the mechanisms for carrying out the cleaning, which may take up to 30 years to restore the environment, is in process, but quite slow. Now, as I begin to round up, one key thing that grassroots activists work on is to, as I said, to go to the context and to find the root of the challenge, the baseline of the problem. And if you look at globally, what really brings people together from grassroots are issues of racism, of neocolonialism, inequalities, gender discrimination, and of course, ecocides, such as what we live with in the Niger Delta, where some parts of environment has been totally devastated. Now, the issues start from the base, but the argument, the struggle to receive responses from authorities and from transnational corporations are often not so effective, except we have the issues from the grassroots connected to the struggles on the global levels. And this is why non-governmental organizations, networks, and movements are extremely important to pick up the impulses from the grassroots, to mobilize the pains and the anger and the demands of the grassroots and take them to the spaces either to governments outside of their territories or to multilateral institutions such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or the CBD dealing with the Convention of Biological Diversity. Now, those spaces actually, the arguments, the major push in those spaces, as we've seen frequently in climate negotiations, for example, at COP15 in Madrid, in Spain, the major climate actions were pushed by indigenous environmental organizations. They were pushed by grassroots organizations occupying the spaces, pushing the arguments, analyzing the negotiations, and picking out all the loopholes that are being created for false climate solutions and bringing this to the forefront. And so you have people working at the very grassroots, away from being noticed, facing incredible challenges, and then coming together from around the world to join forces in spaces for negotiations and making their voices heard. This is also done through global days of action, where you have distributed actions across the world, grassroots organizations actually standing up and making their voices heard in particular actions. And we do know that these issues they're not as easy as I may make it sound. For example, you have cooperation totally embedded in the multilateral spaces, even writing the agreements. For example, during the Conference of Parties meeting on climate change, that the one that met in 2018 in Poland, there was an oil company official who boasted they helped to draft parts of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and they were also the one they were helping to draft the rule book on how to implement that agreement, which actually goes totally against the interests of the grassroots, and which means that the work that needs to be done will continue to escalate and to be done. Now, talk about corporations, and I'm going to round up with this. Talk about corporations. There are certain terms that have crept into become normal in discussions, like terms like accountability, terms like transparency, without people really asking, is this really addressing the root problems? NGOs, grassroots groups, are they being heard when these conversations come about? And so corporations have what they call CSR, corporate social responsibility, whereas communities and grassroots groups are actually asking for corporate accountability, to be accountable for the harm in the ecological and in the environment and the ecosystems around the world. They should pay for the damage. In climate negotiation, we're still debating who pays, who brings about the climate finance, who pays the climate debt, the debt that we owed over the years. And we're hearing another aspect of public relations that corporations have succeeded in doing is to bring up issues of transparency in a way that places the blame on governments and countries and shows them as having very clean hands. And so some NGOs push things like publish what you pay, but some of us actually don't push that, because we want corporations to publish what they take, what they're extracting. We want to know how much have you taken from a territory before we really want to know how much you are putting back. When you say you are responsible as a corporation, the harm you've done, the destruction of the environment, as in the Niger Delta, as in Sucumbios in Ecuador, the harm you've done as a corporation, who is paying for that? Are you ready to pay for that? Then to enforce compliance basically requires a lot of litigation. And litigation as a grassroots can be extremely difficult. Even when you win a case, you are not sure it's going to be enforced or implemented. And so this is where the grassroots and the global level connection becomes extremely important. Litigations are much more likely going to affect the corporation. They're going to most likely comply or even settle out of court when they know that shareholders will be interested and may take different positions than them if they don't change what they're doing. And so from the grassroots to the global level, connections come about in terms of actions, in terms of demonstrations, in terms of marching on the streets, on global days of action, in terms of litigation. But finally, I'll just say that NGOs we're not all cast in one mold. There are some who are totally neoliberal. There are some who are working for corporations. There are some who are extremely progressive. So sometimes this can create fissures and divisions even at the time of negotiation, and spaces get closer and narrower because of this. But of course, this is something that we have to deal with, because you cannot have somebody promoting capitalism and you are more for solidarity and for economies that deal with nature, and then you say you're going to join your hands together to campaign for something. It doesn't happen that way. We have to forge, stand alone where necessary to ensure that we get to the destination we're looking for. These are the thoughts I wanted to share today. And everything we do as grassroots activists is extremely political. We're not party politics, but we must have the correct political analysis. Otherwise, you can't stay strong in your campaigns. Thank you, Cyril. That's where.
Thanks a lot, Nemo. And thanks for sort of casting the net so wide. I realized I forgot to sort of tell everyone one of the other hats that you have, because in Bergen, you are most known as the recipient of the Rafter Prize for Human Rights. And that is precisely because of the focus on connecting environmental justice, climate justice with social justice and human rights, which is of course essential. I now want to give the word to the other panelists to comment on Nemo's presentation and perspectives. Julio, do you want to start? If then you need to put on your microphone and video.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Nemo, for that presentation. It was pretty clear to me. We're working in very similar fashions. I got with this explanation of how grassroots have endurance in time, because that's kind of the main experience we got at the Chevron case. The Chevron litigation, you know, it's been going on for 20-something years, and people are still fighting, and they say they will still doing this until they die. Because they're doing all this fight, all this litigation, all these efforts for the
Julio, it's a bit difficult to hear you, so maybe you should turn off the camera, and then we can maybe hear the sound better. I think we'll come back to Julio. So Deborah, do you want, maybe you could take over.
All right, just a second. Hi, everybody. So thank you very much, Nivo, for your presentation. It was really inspiring and very, it touched upon several issues that I've been working with in the past years. And for example, in the UNFCCC process, and I remember well the meeting in Warsaw where this, what you make reference happened, and how corporations had direct access to country parties to lobby them in a very straight manner. And other networks had to innovate on the ways they made their message heard. So I very much agree with what you point out as the importance of sharing capacities among a network. I mean, the capacities are there, and there's no need to build them, but to share them. And I think that's a very important message, because when you work in a big network such as Friends of the Earth, or the network I have experience with, which is COICA, which is the Indigenous Peoples Coordination among the Pan-Amazonia, the capacities are there. You have to join them and keep a message clear. So I was thinking about how we as scholars, we take a lot of, we give a lot of importance to the structure of organizations, and if they are an NGO, if they are think tank, if they are a social movement. And sometimes that's very misleading, because as you just said, some NGOs might work is strictly with corporations and even mimic the way they actually operate, but the structure still seems to be the one that you may identify with other ways of thinking and ways of structuring messages. So I was wondering, how can we actually see the things in a better way to tackle this issue of keeping an organization and a network resilient as different forces come into change the governance of the environment. So I wanted to bring up the example of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform that has been shaped in the UNFCCC process by the environmental activism of indigenous peoples. And there you see a big gain of indigenous peoples organizations where they innovate inside the structure, the very, very, very organized structure of the UNFCCC, and they create a new body where non-party actors, such as indigenous peoples, can have a space for tackling indigenous knowledge issues in the framework of the UNFCCC, that has very good channels to hear the science, but doesn't have, up until now, a channel to hear indigenous knowledge. And we have this innovation now. We have the institutional arrangement that is kind of okay, like it's pretty promising. And now we have new challenges, because as this institution appears, new actors may use it to convey other kind of messages. So, for example, the notion of local communities is still not agreed in the legal international legal framework. We have some advancement in the FIO, for example, on voluntary guidelines on how to deal with local communities' knowledge and local communities' organizations, but there's still no agreement on what is and what are the rights of local communities. So now that the institutional arrangement is settled, we will have a new challenges over there. So I prepared some PowerPoints, but I don't know if the time would be enough. But Siri, do I have 1 minute?
Yeah, but I think, yes, you can. But maybe I will just give the word to Julio and Camila briefly, and then we have a question from the chat. So, and then and then you can show the PowerPoints.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Julio, please, we didn't hear so well the first time, so maybe you could repeat what you were saying, and then I just finished.
Okay, can you hear me now? It's better? Yeah, I'm right next to the Wi-Fi. Okay, well, I was saying that there's a reason for the Chevron case being now 27 years almost, to have all this endurance, all this time, and that's because of the grassroots movement that is supporting this case. At the beginning, it wasn't like this. The case was started by American attorneys, and they relied on a local environmental organization, which was not focused on oil pollution affecting the people. So after a few years, people organized themselves and created this new organization called UDAP, which is now an international actor. We address this issue of transnational corporations and impunity. I'm sorry, the problem of transnational impunity. I'm sorry, my English. It's too early in the morning, and I haven't been speaking it in a long time. So this local movement grow up to participate at United Nations in the working group for human rights and business that are talking about this binding treaty for human rights and corporations. So yeah, I want to point out what Nimo said about the grassroots movements being rooted in context, because that what allows us to connect, to be informed, and to resist all this time.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Camila, do you want to comment as well?
Thank you. Thank you, Nimo, and thank you, Deborah and Julio.
I think you also have to turn off the camera, Camila, because we can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. Here now, better?
Yes, it's better.
So, it's okay?
Yes, good.
So I think that is that's something that to pay attention is what is called grassroots organization. And I think Deborah make a nice point that when from the academia we try to understand what is the organization and what is to make labels in the organizations that are put in there, and we sometimes we miss the point of to try to understand what is all the resources and all the history of the movement behind that. And I think that something that is interesting is that when you see the organizations that are in the field of climate change, and I think it's much more clear that the difference between and the organizations are much more powerful on putting the difference between these are international NGOs working on climate things, and these are the grassroots organization. It's not that they don't work together, but I think it's clear in a way that they are have the voice, and it's much more powerful the voice than in other cases. In many countries, it's not so easy to make a differentiation, or at least the movement has been more institutionalized and with less links with the grassroots. So I think there is a lot to learn from the climate change mobilization, social mobilization, and the participation, and in the way the grassroots organization has taken place from other places that there is a social mobilization. Yeah, I would say only that.
Thank you, Camila. I have a question from one of the participants in the PhD course, Danilo Boja from Ecuador, and he asks Nimo, but I think the question can go also to Julio. He asks how to make a narrative powerful. Please share a personal experience of the birth and growth of a powerful narrative. And I think this is a very crucial question. So even though Nimo has provided a short answer in the chat, I would really like you to reflect on that a little bit, Nimo, and also Julio, and also, I mean, Deborah and Camila, if you want to join. But Nimo, if you want to say something.
Well, thank you so much, Siri. You know, owning our narrative is a very wide question, and One example I can give is not about not involving me personally. But although I would do this all the time, we try to use different narrative, different formats, like pure poetry, music, to convey the pains of the people in their own words, by telling the story by themselves. This is one way when the victims, in quotes, when the victims present what they are experiencing, they actually are not basing their reports on what they read somewhere or what somebody else has said, but exactly what they experienced using their own language and their own experience. That totally decolonizes the narrative, and nobody can, it's very difficult to campaign against, to tell them, look, what you're saying is not true. It's about what they feel and what they know, what they've experienced. In the case of the movement for Ogoni people, Ken Saro-Wiwa spent time developing and popularizing the language of the people. Because the people the culture have been neglected, the people have been neglected socially, culturally, economically, politically. As they began to write stories in the language, began to tell stories set in that context, to tell the environmental stories, stories of what they used to have, what they've lost, and totally made it so compulsive that everyone had to see, yes, something has been lost and something needs to be done. So that's the kind of platform we utilize to continuously train ourselves to ensure that we decolonize narratives and actually maintain our position and our own experiences.
Thanks a lot, Nemo. Julio, do you want to add something to that? I mean, litigation is a lot about constructing narratives.
Yes, thank you. And since the Chevron case was so long, the narrative was evolving during the time. It started as a class action in New York in 1993. So at that moment, it was about damages to the plaintiffs. And that was it. I mean, the narrative was about environmental irresponsibility, but it wasn't so deep. Indigenous rights, indigenous people were used, I believe. I wasn't involved at that moment. I was in high school. But I believe from what I've seen, from what people have told me, that they were used to appear and to give some image of the bad oil company against the innocent indigenous tribes, while there were a lot of farmers as well. And well, so this changed over the time. When the case moved back to Ecuador, people got more protagonism into their own fight. So farmers and every single indigenous community got in. It was difficult to find one single narrative because for some of them, the cultural damage was the main problem. For some others was the territory. For some others were the rivers polluted, but so we all agreed on justice and reparation. And that has been the narrative for the past, I believe, 10 or something like that years. And that it's a very simple message because we are on this for 27 years already. So we keep asking for justice and reparation. And well, there's a lot more of claims that can be addressed in between this justice and reparation. But well, I won't take more time right now. It was just to say this.
Thanks a lot. I also have some other questions. So Nimo unfortunately had to leave us, but the rest will continue. And I have some questions from the chat, and I will just ask them. I'll just read them out, and then you can all respond to that. But you can think about it. But I would like to also hear So I'll just read all three of them, and then we can have a round. of responses. So the first one is from David Sekamatev, who asks, how do you deal with situations where the NGOs participating in the activism are threatened by the regulator, by the government, in the process of activism? How do you deal with the private sector that will have two faces in activism? They join citizens on the ground to support then later they wait for legislation and influence to suit their interests in parliament committees and cabinet levels. How do you handle such situations in activism? And the other question is from Anna Watson, who asks, hi, thank you for the interesting information. My question is how groups' cohesion is maintained and individual interests are avoided during the process, and also how accountability works in the mobilization. Would you like to start again, maybe, or maybe Deborah, would you like to comment on the questions?
Yeah, we'll go for Anna's question, which is a very important issue now as we see mobilizations, for example, going against structural racism, and I think the example of Black Lives Matter, it's a very good example to answer your question. If you see that case, you have like that movement has identified a common grievance that can be obtained by a single individual, but needs a structural change of rules, which can be the same case for example, indigenous peoples. It's the same matrix. It's racism as a way of organizing the structure of inequalities. And if we assume that as a structural rule, then everybody gains of changing that rule, and no single individual gains of that change, but everybody. And I think that's the same case for gender, and in many ways it's the same case for basic equality in income. So those kind of struggles are very framed in that way, like when you change the big structure, everybody, no single individual can gain, but everybody might gain of it. Then you can avoid elite capture. But when you single out several organizations, and then you only a group can assign resources, then it's harder to not put you in the position of being co-opted. And I think this is a lesson we learn from social movements that are long-lasting, like gender, like anti-racism, and equality, gender issues, and post-colonialism movements that talks about how society as a whole it's organized, and the inconsistencies of inequality that are just justifications and not explanations of how society works, you know, and they're more like justifications. And so maybe that can answer your question. And then you don't need a social movement that it's an organization. You just work as a network, as indigenous peoples do, as anti-racism movements do, as gender movements do. We all hint on the idea and we all gain of it. I hope it's useful.
Thank you, Deborah. Julio, I was thinking maybe if you want, because you also, I asked you to prepare a presentation a little bit more about the work that you've been doing and the perspective of activism. So maybe you could do that, and then also sort of comment on the questions if that fits.
Yeah, that's a very good idea, because if I start commenting on the idea before, spoil my own presentation. Yes, because I'm going to be sharing my own experience in 3 different cases. So I'm going to share my screen now. Is it on?
Yes, it is. It works.
Okay. Take a second. Well, thank you, Siri, for inviting me to this presentation. Nimo is gone. I wanted to thank him too for his wise thoughts that he shared with us. Well, so now I'm going to be using the next 10 minutes, I think, to describe some of my own experience in litigation and activism along to different grassroots organizations. So to do this, I've chosen 3 cases with different level of involvement to show how grassroots organizations represent some advantages over other types of organizations, such as governmental organizations or NGOs that are not rooted in local population. So by saying this, I don't mean to ignore the important role of intermediary NGOs, because they help to build capacity for grassroots organizations. This is a very well-known academic issue, and I mean, there's a lot of literature. So if you would like to read more, I recommend this. This is a very basic research on the issue. Also, I'm aware of the rise of transnational grassroots movements with strong constituency base and sophisticated advocacy capability, both at the local and global level, which is an important phenomenon in this context, because as Nimo just explained, these grassroots organizations are rooted in context. So these movements are formed and led by pure and marginal people or affected people, affected group. So they defy the stereotype of grassroots movements being narrowly focused on local issues. I will explain this with the Chevron case. So let's wait a second for this. Okay, we'll see with these 3 cases that there are some advantages of grassroots organizations over other types of organizations. And this is basically because of the bottom-up approach, which can strategically improve the chance of success in any project involving local population. I mean, it could be a restoration project, a litigation, or any kind of problem involving local population interest. It's better suited for success if it's focused on a bottom-up approach. However, it can also make things harder at some point. So to begin with, I'm going to start talking about a case called Condor Mirador. This is the first open mining project in Ecuador. We basically don't know anything about this. And there's this Chinese mining company, and it's building 2 huge dams to hold these tailings. I don't know if you can see my pointer where it says San Marcos. When the mine starts operating, there's going to be a huge amount of toxic waste, and this toxic waste needs to be deposited forever in these tailings impoundments. So they build dams to hold them. The problem is that these dams sometimes fail. this is how it looks when they fail. So this can be a huge environmental catastrophe. Last March, two United Nations experts on rights of nature presented a request to an Ecuadorian court to suspend the construction of the tailing dams of this mega open pit mining project. I know about this because I was one of these United Nations experts. The claim was heavily supported by scientific evidence. We were just explaining to the judge how these dams are certain to fail. However, the judge had no problem dismissing it, since there were no pressure from society. The economic interest from the government was far more convincing to the judge than our claim. This is a case that I'm talking about this because we didn't count with the support of any grassroots organization on this. There were just a bunch of experts, me, this other guy, and technical experts, and so we filed a very heavily supported claim. But that may work maybe in Germany, maybe in Colombia or somewhere where the judge can, okay, I'm sorry, where the judges are more serious and independent. So, well, this was the first case I wanted to tell you about. The case was dismissed and it hardly reached the news. On a more recent case that is going on right now, there was an oil spill last April. The pipelines broke and 50,000 barrels of crude oil gushed into two of the country's most important rivers, following the rupture of a landslide that broke the pipelines. So this claim was supposed to be filed as soon as possible after the oil spill occurred, because there was a lot of affected people that needed water to survive, that were used to fish in those rivers, and now they weren't able to do so. And the situation was worse because of the COVID emergency. So the claim was supposed to be filed as soon as possible, but many different organizations and people asked us to join the claim. So we had to hold it for almost 2 more weeks. And then after it was filed, there were even more organizations willing to join. So after the judge finally set a date for the hearing, we had to ask the judge to delay the hearing so more people could join. At the end of the day, we ended up with more than 100 affected people and different organizations. So we spent 3 days in court, well, in a Zoom meeting, which was very difficult to do, and we didn't finish. The judge got COVID and the hearing got suspended. So we don't have an outcome to this case yet. I'm telling you this because this case did reach the news. You can search everywhere, because so many organizations and communication teams and grassroots organizations also involved in the field with the people, so that this is very difficult to ignore for the judge, for the government. This is a huge case, but since it became so big, it's very difficult for us to move. There are so many different organizations and so many different perspectives that to reach agreements in certain very specific and strategic issues that have to be decided quickly sometimes take days. So this is where the pipeline broke. and the river got polluted. All these organizations and many more others that I couldn't find the signs were involved. And well, and finally, since I want this presentation to be more about questions, because yeah, I could keep talking about details on these cases for lots of time, but I just wanted to have the main insights so you can ask the questions. So well, the case against Chevron, which is my first case and still going on. Well, as I just told you, this case started as a class action in 1993 in New York, but it was dismissed on forum non-convenience. This is very typical when a transnational corporation it's sued in their own country, they protect it with forum non-convenience. They send the case back to the country where the damage is done because they trust that they can put some pressure and call the shots in our courts. So the case restarted in Ecuador and got to a final resolution just in 2013. At the beginning, there were no grassroots organizations. So the attorneys funding the case decided to use an existing environmental organization called the Amazon Defense Front, which was designated as beneficiary for the claim, and it wished to keep it that way. However, the affected people, as I told you a few minutes ago, recognized the need of a grassroots movement and founded UDAPT, which is the Union of Affected People by Texaco, of people affected by Texaco, well, in Spanish. Well, this organization was supposed to replace the Amazon Defense Front, but it was not the case, since the Amazon Defense Front now refuses to give up its position as beneficiary. Well, in any case, since the judgment has not been enforced and no money has been recovered, the Defense Front's activities have declined. While on the other hand, UDAP, which is a grassroots organization, has grown to become one of the few grassroots organizations advocating at the international level. So even without collecting from Chevron, UDAP is working every day in many different projects to help its own people. So to end up this presentation, I would like to give some final thoughts that can arise from these three different cases. From the first one, we can say that grassroots activism is necessary to be taken seriously in some legal systems. Just like happened to us, invoking our position as United Nations experts, it wasn't impressive to the judge. So we've been told that we should ask some support from grassroots organizations, and I agree now. From the second case, the oil spill in the river, we learned that gathering many grassroots organizations can make you strong, but it also makes it harder to move. It makes you slower. And finally, what we were talking a few minutes ago with Nimon, grassroots provides endurance to a cause because they are rooted in context, allows them to be persistent and to be connected to their fight. So I believe that explains why this case against Chevron, it's been going on for so many time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julio. This was very, very interesting. And it also, for those who are in the course, it will also provide a lot of insights for what we're going to talk about tomorrow in the session as well. Deborah, I want to give you a chance to sort of present your perspectives in a bit more depth before we sort of take the round of questions.
All right. So I'll share also my screen. Then I prepared some slides, and it's going to be very short. So let's start here. Do you see my? Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right. So you kindly asked us this question to start the webinar some days ago. What are the ways in which, in which grassroots organizations, and in the case of the one that I'm going to present, indigenous organizations, contribute to climate governance, and what are the dilemmas they face? So, as I told you some minutes ago, I've been working with indigenous people from the Amazon basin for several years now, and the experience I wanted to share with you has to do with their participation in the UNFCCC process, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And my message is this one. So I could stay with that slide and that would be it. But what I wanted to share with you is that so indigenous peoples have done huge alliances to make some institutional changes in the UNFCCC and in the UN as a whole. And this has to do a bit with what Nimo was pointing out. They are trying to change the way we decide, our mechanisms to decide, following other principles that have to do more with indigenous knowledge than conventional knowledge. It has to do with the recognition of an ecocentric agency for decision making. So cognitive frameworks that perceive non-human nature as a realm where humans are not the exclusive agents deciding on behalf of an inert environment, as it usually is the case in the legal framework, but where environment is approached as a domain of agents that respond to and thereby shapes human decisions. So doing this in the framework of the UNFCCC, it's pretty hard because that's not the way decision making is made. As you know, it's made by countries that sign an agreement and speak on behalf of their population and on behalf of the natural resources they have. So what they have done is a broad network alliances strategy to push for some changes, and that's what I wanted to share with you. So in the case of the UNFCCC, what we have is a space to change some rules so we can coordinate the use of a common, our common atmosphere. And what we try to do is create some rules to regulate the use of an open source system to make it a common. And that's where indigenous peoples intervene. But this space of rulemaking is pretty organized. It has some procedures. It's one of the most organized spaces of negotiation on environmental governance. Although, as Nimo said, some corporations may just lobby some agents and directly write articles of the convention. But even if they do so, these articles have to be accepted by consensus by all the parties. So there's procedures and ways of working that make the process slower, but that makes also that information flows. So some of the challenges that indigenous peoples face is that they have to make very big alliances to work effectively. So what you see, for example, in the case of the UNFCCC is that people come from several origins, and those are the main groups represented, the ones that are more stable over time. And I will just focus very quickly on one of them, which is COICA. And there what you have, it's an effort to make a big alliance that can speak on behalf a whole ecosystem. And that makes the challenge pretty big, but at the same time, the message more defined and more clear. So once you have that message structured, then there's another effort that takes a lot of the space, which is making alliances to make it be heard. So alliances with supranational organizations and NGOs that work at the global level. And what I wanted to convey to you is that on this effort, there's very, very big gains. And one that I really think it's important to highlight is that they have revert a very important stigma that which all the UNFCCC started with, that the land use change, the main driver of land use change that was detrimental to the climate had to do with the activity of indigenous peoples and local communities, and they were part of the problem. Then they became part of the solution in the narrative, and then they had fragmented participation, but by participating in the UNFCCC as non-state actors. And finally now they have an institutional articulation and a that is permanent and connected, which is the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, that is based on, that gives a lot of space to indigenous knowledge. So that closes my argument. If they have a knowledge that is based on a decision-making that assumes the environment not as an inert entity, but as a group of agents, then they start to change the way decision-making is made in the whole of the structure by this seat. So this platform may be an opportunity to recognize other ways of knowing and of deciding. It's still in the making, and it has a classic challenge, which is achieving the objectives of the UNFCCC, and a new challenge, which is keeping the representation alive, like keeping their self-representation alive. So yeah, so if we are tackling global issues, then participation has to be multiscalar, and the links with other legal frameworks that I'm sure you are familiarized with, such as human rights, collective human rights of indigenous peoples, is already a game. Then making the links with other legal frameworks is the next step. So in this context, keeping the capacity to talk by oneself, to be autonomous, becomes really, really important. And there, the role that we all have to keep that ongoing becomes, as Julio says, more important, because all these legal actions have to be supported by a critical mass. If not, it loses momentum. So I hope it was clear. I was trying to make it kind of fast and collaborate to the discussion.
It was very clear and very interesting, very, very interesting. And it has generated, there are lots of questions coming now. So I was hoping I could unmute people to let them speak themselves, and it looked like I could, but it doesn't seem to work. So I will ask some of the questions, or So I will start. So I have questions from, just let me see. So one question is concerns concerns the broader role of traditional religions, whether in Nigeria, the Amazon, or the Andes, relative to Western religion in constructing these narratives and mobilizing action. I think I need to ask the questions that I have, so then you can pick. The second question is going back to Nigeria, spanning from the activist legacy of Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, who ended up being murdered, and the current trend of activists being subdued by government, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South America, where there are a lot of activists being murdered, environmental activists. How do we then motivate our current crop of youths to push hard for different, for what they believe and what should be done in society about different national and global issues like climate change, global warming, food shortage, and bad governance when it's so dangerous? What are our responsibilities pushing in this context? Then there is a question from Daniele, asking about the new institution within the UNFCCC for local communities and indigenous populations. Why is it important to define the concept of local communities? Would it be the fear of this new forum to be captured by those with different agendas? Wouldn't it be better to fight for a structural change in the way decisions are taken at the international level so that their voice would have weight? How do you see and analyze the role of non-governmental organizations for the international climate change regime over the years? And this is only some of them, because there are also the questions in the other chat. And from the other chat, Nasli has a question. Yeah. I can't see that. I lost the chat. Let me see. So there is one question about how accountability works in mobilization. And then there is the question from Nasli saying, what is the role of leadership in the grassroots movements? Which is better, a single leader becoming the face of the movement versus non-hierarchical organization with no distinct leaders? And what works better in what context? Is it possible to end up having a lead person, or is not the case, or is this not the case by default in grassroots organizations? And then Carolina asks how the nature of rights stated in the Ecuadorian constitution plays a role in the 3 cases exposed by Julio. And then there's another question. Thank you, Julio. How has the Chevron case changed the Ecuadorian legislation? In specific, how do you think the Chevron case to the inclusion of rights of nature in the constitution? And what are the claims, narratives that are being presented against the state in the oil spill in Coca River? Yes, so I think that is all. There is one more question in the chat, and then I think we have to put unfortunately, I think that is what we can then do. So I'll ask the last question from the chat, because that is the question is, whichever you see as more, no, so that was fine. That wasn't an answer. Please, now you got a range of questions to pick from. So I will ask Julio to go first, and then Deborah and Camila. And that will also be sort of, the last, what we can manage to do in this session.
Thank you, Sri. I'm going to start with Nathalie's question about the role of leadership and which is better, single leader becoming the face of the movement, because this was crucial in the Chevron case. As you may know, we have a couple of celebrities with us there. I mean, on one side we have the Ecuadorian attorney Pablo Fajardo, who won the global what's the name? Goldman Prize, who won the Goldman Prize and was also recognized as a CNN hero. And yeah, he's a celebrity. And he became the face of the Ecuadorian people struggling. But on the other hand, we have the American attorney, Steven Dossinger, who likes to be the face, who really believes this is his case. And in some way it is, because he's the one who started. He's the one who got the funding. But at some point, his leadership just got out of control at the point that he tried to fire his own clients. You know, yeah. So it can be dangerous if there's a single leader becoming the face of the movement. So that's why UDAPT, the new organization, is not doing that. They rotate the direction of the organization and try to not give that too much attention to anyone, but to the organization. So I believe that's better for a grassroots organization. Although having a popular face can really help you, I don't know, to get funding, to get invited to presentations and stuff. I'm also gonna address the questions about rise of nature. Well, the first one asked about the 3 cases, and well, the Chevron case did not involve rise of nature because they were not in place when the case started. However, the case did play an important role into teaching. It served as an example of what happens in the Amazon and what kind of legislation we need. And that happened when we were drafting the new constitution. So we were invited to talk, and we explained, I mean, we need to invert the burden of proof. You shouldn't be asking the people to prove that they are getting sick from oil pollution. It should be the companies proving that it's impossible that the oil pollution it's getting people sick. There's also a bunch of procedural I will say principles, constitutional principles that are applied into the all about environmental protection and also rise of nature. Rise of nature was the main and only right claim in the Condor Mirador case. Why? Because we filed the claim as UN experts on rise of nature. So we were just defending nature. We didn't want to get involved any human right. We did not call for human environment risks. We were just concerned about rise of nature, which are the right to exist and conserve its energy flow, the nutrient cycles, and a bunch of different criteria that are not followed, are not considered by legislation. But well, I believe we're going to have a talk about this on Monday on rise of nature, because there's a distinction to make between the environment and nature. But we're not going to do this right now, and unless you want me to. It's kind of another discussion. And for the Coca River case, we did claim human rights violations, environmental rights violations, but also rights of nature violations. As a matter of fact, I'm the attorney at that case representing nature. There are a lot of other attorneys representing their organizations, representing the people, but I'm the one representing nature. I asked the judge to consider that the environmental ministry is only talking about environmental legislation to prove that there is no violation on rights of nature, which is nonsense. Okay, and the last question is about, well, I think I already I think I leave it there.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Julio. Before I give the word to you, Deborah, I just wanted to sort of add another comment from Heshetu Figadu from Ethiopia, who says, their panelists, sometimes environmental activities are found to be under the influence of international corporations who restlessly work to exploit natural resources in the expense of citizens in developing countries, which is more a comment, but I wanted everyone to hear it. So Deborah, please. So you need to unmute. You are unmuted.
Sorry. Thank you for the very interesting questions. And there's a key issue on religion and spiritualities that has to do with how do we see the world, no? There's an old debate, you know, in social sciences between Marx and Weber. No, what is first, what we do or what we think and then guides our action. So Weber thought it was more like what we think guides our action, and Marx was more like, let's see what we actually do, and then we will deduce what we think. Maybe they are saying the same thing, and then that can help us to understand many of the things that you said, like, for example, the last question. If we think our structure of industrial capitalism needs raw materials all the time, we think that the world is infinite and we will act believing that, which is a lie. It's not sustained by facts. No, and religion and spiritualities that based other kind of knowledge started by the fact that the world was finite. And so maybe there's a room for more respectful approaches to other ways of knowing that were previous to modernity, and makes more sense now that we have very good data on how our earth systems work. So there's like this very interesting moment where the serpent touches its own end, and very different knowledge get to understand each other. And we can maybe take advantage of that moment to change the way we structure our industries. And then you were asking about violence on the defenders of rights. And I think this is a very important issue, because violence is slow and it's fast. No, sometimes it's spectacular, and sometimes just like with COVID. No, indigenous peoples in Peru and in Brazil have been extremely affected by this disease, and it has been very slow and not spectacular. And it's something that happened already in the past, and we should be asking ourselves about this kind of violent ways that we govern life, no, in the world, by letting people die, and that is absolutely outrageous. And so for people such as you that work with laws, this is something that we should be tackling with strength, because we do have some instruments to make it work. And human rights have gone a long way, and they come with social movements that do believe on human rights. That's something that everybody will defend. but if done correctly, it can spread. And I strongly believe that human rights is something that people it's willing to fight for. So fight for other ways of deciding. Yes, that's the thing. Building other rules of how to build a common, and to building a common is finding ways of working together. It's super hard when it's the whole humanity and everybody has different ways of thinking. But in many ways, it's not impossible. And we can see that happening right now with the critics to structural racism. And the same goes for the things that structure society. It's easy to identify them and criticize them and then try to change them. So if that's the message I would like to convey, like when you see in society structural factors, it's easy to see them. Then structuring action has a lot of negotiation to be done, but the gains are collective. And then the elite capture, yeah, it can happen in particular actions, but the main goal may still be ongoing. So if you see how the gender movement started in the 19th century, yeah, there was a lot of elite capture. But you see that if you compare how women's are and our well-being is from there to now, we can see that there's change. So these things, yeah, should be going faster. Maybe this is a moment where they can go faster. So let's do it. But let's see that when it's structural change, we have more chances to have gains. So I will leave you with that. I hope it's useful, and keep on working.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's very, very, very interesting and very inspiring. Camila, do you want to contribute to some answers as well?
Yeah, just to thank you, Deborah and Julio, and all of you, and just to add on what Deborah has been saying on the structural things and the activists and I think that environmentalists has been killed not because these people with a gun come and say, yeah, I am a climate change denial and you are a threat for my ideology, and they kill them. They are killed because they are a threat for economic interests, and this is fight for territory, and this is coming from what is the role and what is the position of people living in rural areas or indigenous people and in the societies, and how economic groups and economic interests see that what has to be their role. So I think that we have to put that in our minds. It's about territory, it's about structural inequalities, structural violence, and it's not. I mean, what is going on with the indigenous people in Peru and Brazil and part of Colombia due to the COVID is not random. It reflects structural violence that has been there for forever. So I think that is something that we have to put also in mind. So when we speak about indigenous knowledge and the right of nature and other ways to see and to approach to natural resources or territories, and that means also that we have to, there is a history of mistreatment and marginalization of that type of knowledge. So we are also fighting with that, and we have to put that in mind when we are speaking about climate change and organizations, and that having indigenous groups at the international level have a symbolic impact and have a symbolic is per se it's something symbolic there, that they're at the same level of all these white people, and I think that is important per se. And there are things that probably we don't see the change so fast, but there are things that are changing, and we are going to see that. But we are fighting with big things that are super rooted in societies and structures of inequality and marginalization that has been there for many, many years. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Camila. We have to end, but we will not end this discussion. And some of what sort of where Deborah and Camila ended is also going to be the topic of a public webinar that we will have next Wednesday at 8 o'clock Norwegian time, where we will discuss the Amazon, governance in the Amazon in relation to both deforestation and the people living there, and also in the context of the COVID pandemic. So, and we'll also in the class next week, in the different session, so we will discuss many of these issues. And I know that many of you have questions that you would like to ask, and you should just ask them, even if it is on other topics. But there is one last thing that I will do, because I will give at the very final word back to Julio, because he said, are you familiar with the eagle and the condor prophecy? And I think he needs to tell us about that as we end. And with that, I'm going to let him speak, and then I'll just end the webinar. But I want to say to those of you who are in the PhD course that we take a 5-minute break and then you go into the other link. So, Julio.
Thank you, Siri. Yeah, it's because Deborah was just talking about the snake biting his own tail, and yeah, it bring to my mind the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, which is about this knowledge, this being recognized by the other. The prophecy is about, well, the prophecy says that the eagle and the condor used to fly together a long time ago, but then the eagle took the path of wisdom, of not of wisdom, I'm sorry. I'm making a translation while I read. The eagle took the industrial, scientific, and masculine way, while the condor, more intuitive and feminine and creative, took a different path. These two worlds will recognize each other again. The eagle will recognize the condor, and they will fly together. And this is a story that says about division and conflict, but also about union and peace, because the eagle and the condor flying together will give rise to a new human conscience. And there's a John Perkins YouTube video, and there's also a short documentary film that I believe it's available on Netflix if you wanna hear more about this. It's very interesting. It's the anthropocentric and the biocentric worlds getting together.
Thanks, Julio. I think that is a very fitting end to the webinar about strategies that the NGOs and the social movements, the environmental movement needs to join the two. So thanks a lot. Thanks for listening in. And thanks a lot to the panelists. It's been amazing to learn from you.